Hello, this is Chris Ott, and this is part 2 of this series, which I'm calling the Psychic Emergent Universe. In part 1, I explained what I meant by those words, that name, and what this is all about, which is that this is a new cosmology. A cosmology is a theory or an account of how the universe came into existence. And of course, the most famous cosmology is probably the Genesis in the Bible. And but in modern times, they use physicalist interpretations of how the world came about. And the most popular today is the Big Bang Theory. And then there are a lot of other evolutionary theories that you extend onto that to account for the world. And I talked about problems with these physicalist cosmologies, and the whole reason that I make a fuss about this new, very radically different cosmology. Now, this cosmology isn't 100% my own. It comes from mainly 3 authors, which I'll name at the end of this, but give their dates. But they're George Berkeley, Immanuel Kant, and Meher Baba, 20th century spiritual teacher. They all inspired this idea. And it's consistent, at least with what Meher Baba taught. I wouldn't say it's what he taught, because it definitely uses very different terms. It has a different purpose, which is to give a plausible account for how the physical world could have come into existence by psychogenic means, which I talked about that in part 1, and I'll talk a little more about it here, what I mean by that. So the Big Bang is a theory that sort of conceives of space and time and the universe as all sort of like made of substance. And I gave the analogy of this slime, so in the beginning there was the Big Bang, and it all came out of a little hole, and it was a physical hole, and physical stuff came out, but also space and time, which are conceived of as substances, and I talked about that. And so that's a very kind of crude idea of how the world came about. It came about looking very much the way it does now. There's no real process psychologically. You'll see what I mean. They take how we perceive things, which is in sensible qualities, and they project those backward into the beginning, and they imagine essentially sensible quality appearance of the universe. And you can go back to part 1. I go over that in a lot of detail. But I give an alternative, and this alternative is that rather than a physical beginning, there's a psychological beginning, that the world is psychogenic. Genic is like Genesis. It has a psychological origin rather than a physical origin. It ends up being the same world that we're explaining. It accounts for the same world with all the same qualities of, things are hard and stable and things like that. But it starts, and it continues to be actually a psychological process that is producing this world. It produced it, and it continues to produce it. And it produces it from a state which I call intelligence, that there was always an intelligence here. And I'll get into defining how the world, what that entails when we look at the definition of the word intelligence, but I won't do that right now. The point is that this intelligence is what originally was and continues to be, and you can call that intelligence God. Now, I'm not saying that all the things you see are God. Those are the imagination of God, of the intelligence, okay? They're manifestations of the imagination of this infinite intelligence, which is all that really is, okay? And we are manifestations. Our consciousness is manifestation of that intelligence. Now, I want to make a little quick distinction. You might ask, well, this intelligence, whose intelligence is it? No, that's the wrong question. It's presuming of the kind of thinking that we have today, but where that's how we think of intelligence. We think of it, the intelligence of something. But I'm saying something different. I'm saying it's just the intelligence itself that was and eternally prevails, and is really what is going on right now, that intelligence. It's not the intelligence of something, then we'd have to explain that, but that's not what I'm saying. So this is not like God is a person. This is more like God is that infinite intelligence, okay? And that we are really, and not just us, but snails and bugs and plants, everything living and is increasingly sentient and is discovering itself through this process. Now, all of this is in the teachings of Meher Baba, and I don't apologize for that. I grew up surrounded by Meher Baba followers. My parents met Meher Baba when I was a little boy. But I'm not promoting following Meher Baba. I've never done that. I will never do that. I'm just saying this is the source of where I get this idea. So if you want to look further and see what he has to say about this, but he says it in very, very different words. It's more like the words of a mystic, where I'm speaking in the words of a philosopher. So what am I talking about here by this lens? I'm talking about what I call a perceptual schema or way of perceiving, which I'm going to get into in a minute. But if I was to simplify the difference between one cosmology and another, the Big Bang, the current physicalist one, and the one I'm describing, it would be the difference between this little jar of slime, which imagines space and time as being kind of like forms of slime that bend and fold and stuff like that, and wormholes and all that, and just a series of ways of perceiving that this infinite intelligence has, okay? So that's the difference from this to this. Now let me talk about perceptual schemas a minute. First of all, there's something a lot of people don't think about, they don't relate it, although some do relate this to philosophy, is Gestalt psychology. Okay, this is the way you perceive one thing as something else. This is a concept that has always existed in philosophy. It's even in Hinduism. They have the idea of Maya, which they give as an analogy, mistaking a rope for a snake. So seeing the rope wound up and mistaking it for a snake, you're seeing a rope as a snake. That's the example of Maya from Hinduism. And this is similar to that. Gestalt actually literally does this. So I'm going to give some examples. I'm going to put up a picture which is called Jesus in the Snow. It was taken by a man who was a photographer, and he was walking in the snow, and he took a picture. I think this is like the asphalt and the snow where it's melting. And he got home and he developed the picture, and he felt that he saw Jesus. Now I will morph to a picture that kind of adds a little color that might help you see the Jesus figure there. But the point is that it is snow, but he's seeing it as an image of Jesus. So what's the difference? What's that? Nothing changed in the snow and the asphalt, but something changed in the viewer, in the photographer, when he looked at it. So we call that a Gestalt switch. Okay, it's looking at it through a different lens, and you would, of course, had to have seen pictures of Jesus in the past to have that lens. So it's like a memory lens. And you look through that. And it's also a word in psychology also. It's called apperception, sort of perceiving. Your perception is colored by stored experience from the past. That colors your experience. That's like a lens, okay? So another example is, I'll put a cube on. And now, this cube, you might not see this right away, but you can look it up. All these images are easy to Google. You just look up Gestalt images, Gestalt. And this cube can be seen as you're viewing it from the top or you're viewing it from the front. And it's kind of like, and you can't see them both at the same time. It's a flip that happens in you. It's that Gestalt switch, okay? And that is like I'm looking at it through one lens or way of organizing the experience, and it looks like I'm seeing it from the top. And I go the other way, and I'm like seeing it from the front. The lines didn't move. Nothing in my brain happened. It's not like that. It's not like you can just give me an electrical shock somewhere in my brain and I'll see it a different way. Something psychologically has shifted in me completely. And what is that difference? I'm organizing the same data, if you want to use that word. I like the word qualities, the sensible qualities. I'm organizing that same experience and the information in it in a different way. Okay, so here's another. This is an image from Gestalt. You can look at this as two faces looking at each other, or you could look at it as a vase. Okay, it looks a little like a vase. And that's enough. So you get that idea. That's what I'm talking about very, very roughly. But that concept of seeing something or perceiving something, and we don't just mean the eyes, we could mean smelling or anything, but organizing the experience in a different way causes you to experience different things. So what you experience is at least partially the effect of how you are organizing your experience of whatever is there. And this idea can actually even explain what is even there initially to be looking at. But all of this is in my books. At the bottom of every video, at least in the last year, you can go to the show notes, and I give a link to a video and essay hub. All my essays, all my videos, everything. And at the very, very top, I have both my books, and they're downloadable for free. The 2004 shorter book, just called The Evolution of Perception, you can download that as a PDF, the actual original published book, and because it's out of print. And then the other one is on Amazon. It's called Evolution of Perception Re-Explained. And I give a link to it at Amazon, but I also give a link to a sort of a second edition that I'm working on that I haven't published yet. But I'll give it away. You can download it. You don't have to order the book. But anybody can read this. I'm not making this up as I go along. As a matter of fact, sometimes it's hard for me to even remember my own ideas that are in those books because I don't think about this all the time. If I may just go on a tangent for a second. Philosophy isn't, if somebody sent me a book about philosophy, I wouldn't read it because that's not really what I'm doing anymore. I'm trying to explain this idea, this epiphany that I had 20 years ago, but I'm not doing this now. Actually, my main interest that I follow when I want to sit around, kill time, drink some coffee, is geopolitics. I'm all into geopolitics. I don't know why. It's kind of depressing lately, but anyway, I follow it very closely. So I'm not following this at all. But I appreciate that people do. I think I wish one day that people would understand my idea, and I'd love to be, interviewed about it. I've never been. Well, I've been interviewed a couple times. Okay, so off that. That's. I just wanted to add that. So. It's not like I'm obsessed with this. As a matter of fact, I have to work hard to focus on these talks. They're hard to do. It's a lot to have to keep track of. Okay, so now I've explained the basic concept of this evolution, or cosmology, which I call the psychic emergent universe, is a sense of seeing one thing as another. So now I'm going to use the analogy of time. Not the analogy of time. I'm going to use the example of time and space to convey some of the aspects of this idea of seeing something in a certain way, which colors anything that you then afterward see. So, and these lenses they're not literal lenses. This is the symbol of the perceptual schema or way of organizing experience that is psychological, not physical. But I use a physical object to be a symbol. And so let's take time. Now, in part one, I went over this. I talked about how Kant came up with the idea that time is not a thing, like a physical thing, like they think today, and it's not a concept because it's not synthetic that way. It's not made of ideas. It is an intuition that's innate, that you're born with, and it organizes your experience. It's exactly the same. Kant's idea is exactly the same idea as what I'm describing. As a matter of fact, that's where I originally got this idea. And I asked a Kant professor from Cambridge, I said, is Kant mean by these intuitions of time and space, does he mean like a lens? And he goes, yes, that's exactly what he means. So now Kant didn't talk about lenses, but it's interesting because the lens was, the tinted lens was invented only maybe 20 years before he wrote his main book. I think that it may have influenced his thinking because before the invention of tinted lenses, here's a tinted lens. See, so I made it a little pink. See, they really wouldn't have thought of this of the analogy of a lens because they'd never seen tinted lenses. Okay, so I'm going to read this about time. So let's say time is like the first lens. It has to be the first because nothing could come afterward, because you couldn't have afterward until you have the concept of time. So there's this time lens that the intelligence has imagined as a way of organizing any subsequent experience. Now, when considering time, this will explain some of the dynamics of this idea. When considering time, you don't see time with your eyes, or feel it with your hands. Rather, we see and feel objects around us in terms of time or temporally. So it's adverbial. It's like an adverb. We don't see time, we see things temporally. It's a way of organizing our experience of objects around us in a meaningful and coherent way, time. Now, the same with space. Space, we don't really see space. We see things spatially. So this is like a second lens. So through the lenses of time and space, we organize any subsequent experience that evolves in terms of time and space, meaning temporally and spatially. Remember, those are adverbs. This is an action. It's a psychogenic action. And we still can use an adverb. Just like you ride a bicycle fast or slow. That's an adverb, fast or slow, to an action. And here the action is perceiving. We perceive a certain way. This is all in my second book. I use that exact analogy of a bear riding a bike in a circus, fast and slow. Okay, so we repeat this with space. It is a way of organizing experience. We don't experience space. We experience things spatially. So that's the idea. This is an idea in philosophy. Now, I just want to say I'm going to now use an analogy. In this concept, what evolves space and time is eventually, in terms of is a world that is mathematical and completely mental. And if you removed all sensible qualities, because you went backward before there were any brains and nervous systems, that would be the world. The world would be mathematical. But then your body, which has to necessarily have evolved mathematical, everything's really mathematical that you look around and see. It's really mathematical on a certain level. But how do you see it the way you do with color and sound and fragrance and all that? Well, through your nervous system. So while you are a mathematical entity, through that evolved mathematical entity that has developed the sense organs and the brain and nervous system, you have the ability to perceive that those mathematical states that are ongoing, and that is what the world is. You are able to perceive them as sensible qualities like color, sound, scent, taste, touch. And so I use an analogy for this. And it's an analogy for the importance of your body. You have to have a body to perceive the world. It's like your window into the world. Now I'm going to give the analogy of a TV hooked up to a game console. And I've said gone over this many times, so I'm going to do it again. I have some different images that might help jar people to see what I'm saying. Let's say you're playing a computer game. One of them I always use is Skyrim. I really like it, and it's a game that it's called first-person immersive game. That means you play the character, and it's immersive, meaning you forget that you're in a game. You start being that character, walking through that world, and it has color and sound. It doesn't have the other sensations, but it does vibrate the console, so there's a little feeling of touch. And but what's actually on the console is mathematical on the hard drive. It's ones and zeros. But your television and your console are converting those ones and zeros that the game is written in into sensible qualities of color and sound. So let's just quickly go to that, and let me try to show what I mean by that. So we see I'm now moving through the Skyrim world as the character. I'm immersed in the game. And then we can sort of peel back the surface, and underneath, what do we have? The actual numbers that are going on. So this is an example where your console is doing that converting physically, and then it turns it into colors and sounds on your monitor. And then you are experiencing those mathematical states as sensible qualities. So the console and the monitor are acting analogous to your body. You have to have a body to perceive the physical world, and that is why. So that's that idea. Now I wanted to add something else, because I've not really talked about this too much, but it's important. So I've used this analogy of a lens. Okay, now lenses were only invented in the 1750s, and but that's shortly before Kant had his concept of his intuitions of space and time. But I want to say something about this. So let's say this is time. Okay, that's the lens of time. Now let's say I'm looking through this. Now everything that I see is organized temporally, as I said. Okay, because this is an intuition that grants me that. Okay, but notice that while everything is in appearance, what we call the phenomenal world, phenomena means anything that you can experience, is organized in time, and so you could say it's in time, that is not the case with the perceiver, if this were true. The perceiver is not in time. The intuition is producing the illusion of time, but it doesn't fall into the scope of what is seen through it. Is rather what he perceived. Now, this intelligence, which I said is God, is really the only witness that's perceiving through all of us, through all of these lenses. And your sense of being a separate body over there and me over here, and we're having an argument, is because these lenses become individual once the person evolves more. And I talk about all this in my book. Now, so he is seeing from that one witness. Now, why would I say that? Because since space and time do not exist for the reality that's the witness, God or the infinite intelligence, it can't be divided. You couldn't divide it. You can divide anything phenomenally in the illusory world, but you can't divide the reality that's perceiving it, because it doesn't fall into the scope of these dimensions. That's important. That sort of explains intuitively things that are said in mysticism, which are generally misunderstood. So when Richard Albert writes a book called Be Here Now, he sounds really spiritual, but he's just parroting what he's heard mystics say. He doesn't understand that in the phenomenal world in which we operate, you can't be here now because you're in a world of time, and you have to be honest and not a hypocrite. He experiences time, and then he wrote another book later called Still Here. Because it really doesn't make anything happen to him. It's just pretending to be a mystic that has this experience. Now, a real mystic, we could say, he has a final epiphany where he actually knows that the world of time and space are illusions. For that, you got to go to mystics and read what they say. Richard Albert's not a real mystic. He's just an author. Like me. That's all I am. I'm just an author. I read books. I think about them. Then I give my own spin. So, if I pause too long, I'll try to remove some with a cross dissolve when I edit this. Okay, this is how the psychological... Okay. Now, I was going to give a point, and then I'm going to give a couple examples. There's a thing called radical philosophical behaviorism. That's a very radical materialist view. It's a strong materialism. And they believe that mental states, especially private ones like, angst and stuff like that, that we complain about are not real because they're not physical. There's only the physical. And what they mean by the physical is that which you can observe on the outside. So, if I'm embarrassed and I turn red from embarrassment, you can describe the red complexion on my face and say he turned red. But that's really what you mean by embarrassed, is the outside. Get it? This supposed inside-outside dichotomy they have in this behaviorism, which is really odd. I don't... anyway, that's how we speak, though. We say, how do you feel inside, about this? So they deny that they're internal states. And to do this, they translate mental words into physical words or external state words. So let's say a person's happy. Well, they say, well, what do you do when you're happy? Well, your lips go up. So when we really should say his lips went up, you've heard of Pavlov's dog, so you don't say the dog's hungry, you say the dog is salivating. So, because you can see the salivating or measure it with a device, but you can't the other. And the same with the mouth up. This is kind of a bogus thing because I'll show a picture of from a painting by Rembrandt of some medical students observing an autopsy. And they're all observing, right? They're objective, but we wouldn't be able to say in this behaviorism that they're observing because that's a mental word. We have to say that they're pointing their heads at the cadaver, right? Because that's the physical fact. Right? But they wouldn't say that because they're just confused. The whole idea is predicated on their own internal experience. So I've said that before, but that's just a sort of moot point because it's not my point I'm trying to make. The point I'm trying to make is that here we do the opposite. In a psychogenic, psychic emergent universe, we translate words that are physical and we try to account for them in psychological terms. And a lot of people really won't object to this. I've heard criticism of anybody that tries it, but nobody's tried it this way. There's a thing called phenomenalism, and that's the idea that there's only really just sensible qualities, like the color and sound and so forth. And I'm not saying that. I'm saying that those are just interpretations of mathematical states. I'm not saying that. And I'm saying that even the color and the sound are illusory. And so is the math. And so is time and space. And the laws that govern everything. They're all illusory. So this is not phenomenalism. Phenomenalism is that which you perceive, that stuff, those sensible qualities are what things are. But that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that there's a psychological process of ways of perceiving that evolve, that form the experience that we're in. We find ourselves in that world that once it's evolved. But I'm going to give an example where I take something that's generally hard for philosophers to explain, and it's very, very easy to explain this way when you look at it through the lens of this idea of these lenses, to be funny. So we're going to talk about language second. And if I can explain a language, actually I'll be able to explain thought and writing and a lot of things. So I'm going to give an example of how we explain language. And then we're going to explain like a couple other things using the same kind of process of an evolved way of perceiving. Well, okay, so I have to tell a little story. I think it's in my second book. But this is what happened. To prepare for my book, The Evolution of Perception Re-Explained, I spent about 2 years just reading in McDonald's and in the library. And I was constantly ordering books through interlibrary loan, which took a long time to come. And that was kind of my routine. I did that for 2 years. And and I had recently moved back to Myrtle Beach, where I now live, and I was not familiar with where the library was initially. And I found that the sign for the turn to the library on the highway, which is kind of a cluttered part of North Myrtle Beach, with all kinds of signs. There's like too many signs. There's a little teeny green sign that's somewhere that says, with a little arrow, and it goes library. But I would miss it every time because there's so much to look at. And I'd be thinking about, the book. And so I'd miss it. I'd drive all over the place. I couldn't find the library. And this became kind of absurd because I'd done this like 10 times. So, philosophers are supposed to be kind of airheaded, Anyway, I won't go into that. That's an ancient idea that they bump into things and don't know where they're going because they're thinking. But this is the case. So it occurred to me, I need to have this little sign. It's not big enough. I never noticed it. I need something more prominent. I need some kind of what do you call that? A landmark. So I noticed that right at the road where you turn to go down a ways to where the library is, there was a neon sign for a little bar called Martini. And it was the sign was green, and I'll show a picture of it. And I'll show a picture of it in the evening. I took this picture in order to tell this story. I think I have this picture in my book in black and white. But the Martini sign became my indicator that I had arrived at the library turn. And so I'd be looking for the Martini sign, and you can't miss it. And so it occurred to me that this is how language works. Is nothing happened to the sign, nothing happened to the library. All that happened is something in me where I perceived the sign as a landmark for where the library is. The way we could put that in more technical terms is I saw the sign, the neon sign, as a sign for a library, which is its referent. So the Martini sign is the sign, like a letter in an alphabet for a sound, let's say, and the library is its referent. So really, when I saw the Martini sign, I didn't see Martini. I saw library. I mean, not literally, but that's effectively what it was like. Like that's the sign for the library. So all that changed is a way of perceiving that sign. Instead of just seeing it as a sign, I saw it as a symbol for a referent, which was the library. So again, it's like perceiving the cube from the top or the front. Nothing changes the lines of the cube. What changes is something in me, the way I'm organizing that experience. So I'm organizing my experience of the Martini sign as essentially a word for library, a symbol for library turn. All right? I never had a problem finding the library after that, and I could find it anytime, and I could help somebody else to find it. So turn it the Martini sign. And so now you take that idea, then you can extend that to writing. I put a picture up of cuneiform. Cuneiform was the first form of writing by the Sumerians that about I think 3000 BC it appears. And originally it was little hieroglyphs and stood for things, but gradually these symbols in the cuneiform came to stand for sounds. So just like in our alphabet, like a K stands for K, and an O stands for Ah, and so forth. So again, it's the same idea. The symbols, there's nothing special about the symbols. They're kind of arbitrary, but it's the way we are organizing their relationship to what to their referent. So by doing that, we're able to actually write and read cuneiform if we know the language that they spoke in, because different languages used cuneiform for a long time. It persisted for a very long time because it took a while for others to come up with other forms, like later others that came along were Greek and Hebrew and Sanskrit. But it was the first, and so that's important. Now, since writing and is just looking at at squiggles as organizing them as, or the squiggles and what they refer to, it organizes them as having that relationship. That's how thought happens. All thought is just remembering, sentences and repeating them in your mind, and so it's basically the same thing. And once you have the language, you have thought. I rebelled against that originally because I thought, oh, what about imagination? Because my father was like a painter. Well, that's also part of thought. But, really, what we mean by thinking in philosophy is internal dialogue, internal monologue, talk. And that's why, I won't go into that. Okay, I'm going to give another example. Money. There's lots and lots of white papers about what is money. What is it fundamentally? Is it a form of energy? Is it a form of of control? Or what is it? What is money? Well, money is the same thing. It's a way of organizing experience so that we can get commerce done. So we put an item of value on something, so it's a trade value, and we might use gold as an intermediary. So how much gold is horse worth, and then the trade value of a certain amount of gold. But money gets a little more deeper. Money becomes sort of a referent for a certain amount of trade value or gold. And so you're just looking at whether they're coins, minted coins, or paper money, and you look upon it as a sign for the referent being its trade value, which is what you could get in exchange for it. So you're seeing it as having an exchange value. Does it really have an exchange value? No. And people are always pointing this out, but it's not a big deal. Yeah, it's true. Gold intrinsically doesn't really have any value. But so long as we perceive it as having value, then it does. And that is perceiving gold as having intrinsic value. It doesn't matter whether it has it or not. If you perceive it, you're sort of reading it into it. And we were able to operate that way. Because that's how money works. Money works through a lens. And so that's about three things we just explained. Right? We explained writing, we explained thought, we explained money. And all of them are explained the same way. So I am translating physical concepts, like money seems like a physical thing, but I just explained it's really a psychological thing. And same with the writing, same with thought. Isn't that funny? Who would have thought that thought was psychogenic? Well, I always did. But today in materialism, they try to deny that. I am going to go a little further and make this a little longer. So there's this idea of birth and death. Okay, we all see, a farm animal. If you lived on a farm or visited one, you might see a new colt or something, and it's alive, and it was just born, and it came from its mother. And how would we interpret that physically? Well, kind of like behaviorists, we would say, well, what we mean by a live horse, live colt, is that it's moving, it's breathing, its heart's bumping, it's able to perform certain functions, can drink milk, and it can gallop, and it grows, and its cells do this. And these are all physical, sort of observable from the outside states. But I want to translate that now to the idea of lenses, okay? Now, death, of course, has always been correlated with the opposite. A thing that was moving and warm and breathing and had a heartbeat and seemed to be, experiencing things and stuff like that and reacting. It's suddenly not. It's just dormant. It's inert. It turns cold. It begins to decay. Part of life is that it's sort of constantly rejuvenating itself, where this stops pretty much right away upon death. So death is, again, understood in these sort of external terms. But now let's look at it a different way. This is really a big part of our society today in global politics, is this idea, like, is abortion good or is it bad? When does birth happen? When does life commence? Is it on conception or, and they debate about it, but this is, and I'm not getting into that debate. I'm not political, but this is a thing that people think about. And I get this from Mayor Baba. I wouldn't have thought of it, by the way. How would we explain taking a birth and dying? And also, I'm going to talk a little about reincarnation, which is a different kind of reincarnation. I've said this everywhere now. So I have videos about this. I'm not sure anybody's listening to me. As soon as I say reincarnation, they click off and they don't understand. You're not listening. I don't mean what you think I mean. So let's listen to me. Birth is really not a soul going inside of a fetus. Okay, that's called transmigration of the soul. But as I just described, the only real soul is this one soul, psych, God. It's the only real witness. All this idea of a bunch of souls, you can talk about that because the sanskaras create a sense of separate identity, which is like that individual produces the sense of the subjective sense for that person of being a separate individual. You can call him a soul if you want. How many souls were on the airplane when it crashed? We talk like that. So, people or animals, they're souls. But really there's just this one soul. It's the one soul behind all those finite souls. It's the one infinite self within every finite self. Okay? Now, but through the sanskaras, it finds itself in this world that it produces through imagination. And when it takes a birth, it identifies with the fetus at a certain stage. And that moment of identification, which Mayor Baba does go into this in more detail in a series of sanskaras that actually produce the body itself. But anyway, your body is actually like patterned on the residue of impressions left over from the previous life. And anyway, so of course it will at some point identify with those impressions and then that body, which are essentially like totally related and linked up. So now, so you get it? So death is disidentification and birth is identification by the soul, the one soul, by God. But because you have acquired impressions, God has acquired impressions uniquely for its life as each individual, it's like the individual identifies. Hope you can follow that. If not, go read. But because none of this, I'm not making this up. All right. It's all available. So it's identification. So now that's a way of translating what was only explainable in terms of very external physical signs like, it's breathing, it's not breathing. That's not life. Those are some of the functions that can be performed by a living object. But the actual life of the event of taking birth is this identification with that body. And right now, I say that I'm alive. I don't know how long I'll be alive. I have a lot of health problems, heart disease. But In the meantime, I identify with this body. What is this body? It's me. That's how I experience it. All this I'm talking about, the self, the soul, this is all just philosophy. It may be true. It probably is true. I believe it's true. But part of this account is that through the impressions that I have, that I've gathered over this evolution, I experience myself as this body, which is actually the mold of those impressions that I've gathered. And so now, that's another. Okay. So I want to compare it back to this kind of thinking. This is the thinking I'm replacing. The thinking I'm replacing thinks of just about everything, it reifies it into some kind of stuff like physical stuff, rather than looking for a process that's not physical, that produces the physical, the appearance of physical, or what we call physical, and all those qualities. It wants the original fundamental to be a stuff, always. I don't. This is the opposite. Remember, this is, I say you could simplify things as, here's one way to think, this is this new way to think, okay? So, an ordinary way of explaining reincarnation is that the body fails and then this soul stuff, you know, remember? It's kind of like space and time coming out of the Big Bang, which I talked about in part 1. It comes out, Plato thought like this. He thought that the soul kind of comes out of the feces, kind of rises up, and then it goes to another body, and let's call this coffee cup the new body, and then it's going to drop in there. You know, now that's got a soul in it. Well, that's kind of barbaric. There's no evidence of that. But there is evidence that I identify with this body, because it's just a raw fact. All right, I've covered everything that I had to cover. Let me make sure. Let me look here. Because I had a lot of ideas. No, I have something else I want to say. And even if this video is a little long, sometimes they are. But this is really worth saying. You know, the first time thinking like this, of this lens idea, came about was by Kant, who came up, sort of, without saying it, he was using the analogy of lens. Now, the tinted glasses were actually invented just not long before. So, was it 1754 or something like that? So the people of the early Enlightenment before Kant could not have had this analogy that I'm describing, these tinted lenses, this like looking through a lens as a way to explain, and then now the next thing is, remember, this is an evolution of perception. That's another term I use for the psychic emergent universe, and the title of 2 books of mine. But, what was I going to say? That's only half of it, because the other half, besides the introduction of the idea of the perceptual schema, ways of organizing experience, which it also helps to have some Gestalt psychology to see what we mean by this, is the evolution. That time evolved first as a way of perceiving, and then space, and then, the natural laws, which are relations of time and space, and then, the objects composed of the natural laws, like the planets, and then finally you have biological evolution, and then the soul identifies itself with the living thing. And that is an evolution, okay? Now, they not only couldn't have thought of the analogy of lens prior to Kant, but they couldn't have had the analogy, that's not an analogy, they couldn't have added on the concept of evolution, because they didn't have the idea of process philosophy. Processes producing the world. Today, it's not just biological evolution by Darwin that's a process, but there are other processes like plate tectonics I talk about a lot, and many, just about anything that's explained in science today is explained in terms of an evolving process. Okay? But that thinking didn't exist until the 19th century. So you don't hear about this when they were trying to figure these things out. And that is why they had to stick with Genesis, the idea that the world was created in 6 days by God, because they didn't even have the concept of evolution, let alone Gestalt lenses. So having this idea of a psychic emergent universe was impossible until about the time I thought of it, really. And then you have to add that Meher Baba's writing, which he did in the 1920s, which I didn't actually read until like 2005 because it wasn't in print. That stuff is like lost material, where a lot of these ideas came from. So I had that advantage, but there's one other thing besides the invention of the lens, the invention of evolutionary or process theories for explaining things, explaining the cause of things. But there was no psychology. Remember, the psychology was invented in the 1800s. It's mostly credited to Freud. So without psychology, you really couldn't, and let alone Gestalt psychology, you couldn't have this. You have to have the idea of the subconscious and so forth, because a lot of these things are stored in the subconscious. For instance, if I see a murder by a bearded man when I'm a little boy, and then later every time I see a bearded man, I like wet my pants. That's because the memory of that bearded man is in my subconscious. So you have to have psychology. That's, by the way, called apperception. It's the same concept as seeing one thing as another's, or organizing your experience in terms of some lens that is acquired in the past. And lastly, I need to say, and I'm sorry to add, I knew that this was going to be long. But one more thing is I said that reincarnation, no, I covered that. Reincarnation is not the transmigration of the soul. Okay, so when I say that there's reincarnation in this idea, I do not mean the reincarnation of like Madame Blavatsky and the Theosophists or something. That's not what I mean. And this is clear in for me. It's in a book called The God Man about Meher Baba, and the author is approved by Meher Baba, and he clearly says this is not what we're talking about. This transmigration. That's like in Buddhism, and Hindus kind of have this idea of kind of like a walk-in where, one soul goes in, takes over a body. That is not what we're talking about. That's something else. That's more like demonology, or possession. You look up walk-in. Wikipedia has a little article about it. That's not what we're talking about. Not. We're talking about identification and disidentification, and it's identification and disidentification from the one original and still existent and prevailing and eternal infinite intelligence. There are not really a bunch of souls in the world of space and time moving around, bumping into each other, going into bodies. That's all fantasy. So I wanted to say that because people have in the West, and probably a lot of the East, have a very hard time grokking this idea of reincarnation. But it's necessary, because when I talk about evolution, and then finding yourself in the world, through your impressions that you've acquired, that evolution is one that involves a kind of reincarnation, of taking experience as a form and then dropping that, disidentifying, but retaining the impressions gathered during that life that then form a mold of the next body that you then identify with, and this is how the world evolves. And that's a very important and major part of this cosmology. They can't be separated. But I'm not talking about transmigration of the soul, some Buddhist Hindu theosophical idea. I'm talking about something unique, something different. And now, lastly, about this evolution and these ways of identifying and disidentifying, this is a really strange way to think about evolution, because normally, I'll show a picture, that when we think of evolution, we think of those finches that little birds that Darwin collected when he was on his voyages of the Beagle, the ship he was on. And he put them together and lined them up. And like, this is evolution. Like this, he turned into this and turned into this. But this is different. What I'm saying is that these bodies are the residual, like, byproduct of an internal evolution, a psychogenic evolution, a psychic emergence experience by God. Okay, and so God experiences himself as each one of those finches. When it dies, we can, through our sense organs, we can see them in terms of sensible qualities and preserve them, put them in formaldehyde or whatever we do. But the life, when it was alive, was really most fundamentally an experience, okay, a way of experiencing. You say a way of experiencing through all the lenses that it has acquired. So it's kind of like through a complex lens, okay, of multi-parts. That's called a compound lens of all of our acquired impressions, including time and space. We're seeing through all these. Now, that sounds really, really different and radical. And I always say radical, new. Like my second book is called A Radical New View of Reality. But it's not that radical. Although you're not going to find this in any religious school, there are philosophers who have thought like this. And one of them is a person named Jacob von Uexküll. And you can look him up. And Jacob Uexküll was a Baltic German biologist who lived from 1864 to 1944. And he interpreted biology in terms of a concept which he called Umwelt. And Umwelt is the experience of a particular kind of animal. Okay, so there's a book by a guy named Thomas Nagel called What Is It Like to Be a Bat? Well, this has already been thought about by Uexküll, the turn of the century. Uexküll believed that is what the world is. The world actually is Umwelts. So the biological world, so a butterfly, the way to describe a butterfly really most truly is the butterfly experience, which is different than a fox experience. Totally different because he has different sense organs. He has a whole different thing going on. And we know a little about this, but this is what he felt. And he felt that what we perceive as the human Umwelt, and so he saw the world entirely made of Umwelts. This is what I'm saying. This is what Meher Baba actually was saying, and it's not understood. I've gone over this. I did a whole series called What Meher Baba Really Taught. It's really that Meher Baba would describe an evolution of Umwelt. So I wanted to add that. This was brought to my attention by an author named Coralie Kuntz, who's still alive, from the University of Chicago. And she said, if you write another book, make sure you mention Uexküll, because that's what he said too. So that's how I want to end this. I'll have to think about what is left, if anything, to add to this. I'll certainly have a conclusion if no more parts, but I'm coming to the end of saying my piece. 20 years ago, when I started writing that little book, The Evolution of Perception, based on a shorter paper, about 10 pages that I wrote for my professor, for him to look at. We talked about it. I could never have imagined spending all these years and doing 80 videos and writing 2 books and writing maybe a couple of dozen papers, which are online. As I say, go to the show notes and there's a link to the Chris Ott Hub and you can download everything. But I would not have I didn't know I'd spend so long, but I found that people have a hard time understanding it's too radical. I was even told that by a professor who's now dead. Poor man. Anyway, He said, couldn't you kind of come up with something like halfway between what we think and this? No, you really can't. There's no halfway. There's a Gestalt switch even here. This in itself is a new way of looking at the world, which is explainable in terms of like a collective group lens. Okay? And I said that in my very first book. All right, I hope this has been at least marginally clear. If not, as I said, you can always stop my videos or go back. You can hit J. That makes it go back a few seconds, 10 seconds. Or you can go to the show notes, download any of my material, read it, read Mayor Baba's writing. And as I've been promising, I wanted to give the three main sources of this idea, which I'll now do in the end credits. And thank you very much for subscribing to my site and watching these videos. I've mostly enjoyed it, although it's sometimes kind of tough because it's an awful lot to hold in your head. All right, take it easy, and see you in another part. There'll be at least one more part of this series. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.